This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Welcome to From the Woods, Kentucky. I'm Laura Lhotka, and I'm here with my co-host Renee Williams. And today in studio we have Dr. Tammy Horn-Potter and Doug Potter. And Dr. Tammy Horn-Potter is the Kentucky State Apiarist at the Kentucky Department of Agriculture. And we also have in studio Doug Potter, who is a graduate student in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Kentucky. And he's done a lot of work on research in bees in the forest. So it's a pleasure to have both of you in the studio today to talk about bees. Tell us how you got started and what got you first interested in bees.
So I had planned on a career of being an English professor. I was never going to do math, science, or agriculture, period. I had grown up on a pig farm, and when I went to college, I was never going to go back to that kind of hard work. But when I finished my doctorate in English, my grandfather needed help with his beehives, and so I decided I would come home for a week, and that lasted the rest of the summer. As soon as we opened the beehive, I knew I should have always kept bees. And so I think I'm a good example of somebody whose hobby became a career, and I just kind of kept walking toward it. The University Press of Kentucky reached out to me in 2002 because I was publishing about honeybees and literature. And Jennifer Peckinpah was the editor at that time, the acquisitions editor. And so she said, she made a deal with me. She said, you know, your eyes light up when you talk about, you know, your work with honeybees. She said, if you get me a manuscript, you know, in 9 months, she was having her first baby. She said, I will see what I can do in terms of a contract. And so I did. That you know, for the rest of the 9 months, I did everything I could to get her a manuscript that would be worthy of a contract. And so that became the first book, Bees in America, How the Honeybee Shaped a Nation. And although Jennifer and I obviously didn't time it this way, it was published in 2005. And that was the first year that there wasn't enough hives to pollinate almonds in California.
Oh, okay.
And so that book came out, and this crisis happened in terms of the lack of bees. And so it really got a lot of exposure, that book, and I think it kind of surprised everybody, including myself. And then I just kept walking towards the bees. I decided I was the National Endowment of Humanities Chair of Appalachian Studies at Berea College. And there was a research component in that chairpersonship. So I chose to go to Hawaii and work in the queen bee industry. And I did that for 4 winters after that. And that led to working with the coal industry in eastern Kentucky to try to get pollen and nectar producing trees on surface mine sites, make that much more of the mix. And that led to being the state apiarist. It's a dog-legged career. It's not one for everybody, but I think for many people, you know, we have a tendency to be very linear in our approaches to careers. And I think I'm somebody that's an example who I've really enjoyed all the dog legs.
Yeah, no, that's
With your
great.
background, though, it would have had to have helped with you writing your book, though.
Oh, absolutely. The ability to crank out grants has been fundamental, you know, to being a success. And especially in the Kentucky Department of Agriculture, I think people tend to forget that trees are a crop.
Right.
And so it's been a real asset to be able to kind of pull in some grants to Kentucky, you know, to look at hive health as a priority, and then also, as I said, to work with Green Forest Works, you know, to kind of keep the idea here that trees are a crop and that they're a form of agriculture, and we can't forget that moving into the future.
Right. So, Doug, how did you get interested in bees?
Essentially, I married into it. I had no contact with bees. I'm originally from Louisville. My undergraduate work was in economics, so it didn't have anything to do with bees.
Uh-huh.
I worked in construction and land surveying and project management before that, and I was at EKU to get certified so I could become a official land surveyor.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up meeting Tammy and getting involved with bees, and I worked for her program, Cold Country Bee Works, for a while, and it's worked out really well.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
So tell us a little bit about the bees and why they're so important to our both forested and non-forested lands.
Many people don't realize the necessity of having pollinators for our food supplies.
Mm-hmm.
You know, well over 30% of many of our fruits and vegetables have to have what we call seed set in the industry, and that is when pollinators are able to move pollen from one plant to the other.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when we get these luscious, blackberries, strawberries, pumpkins have to have a special bee, although honeybees can cover that. So we have to have, for many of our lifestyles, we have to have pollinators. We don't always understand that relationship. Even wildflowers, 70% of our wildflowers are pollinated.
Oh, wow.
And the honeybee tends to get the attention. It's the darling of the United States agricultural infrastructure. But there are over 4,000 native bees that are just as important. The bumblebees are exceedingly important to the blueberry industry. Many of us love pumpkins in October, and there's a pumpkin bee that has evolved with pumpkins since they're native to North America.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the things that impact the honeybees also impact these native bees too.
Mm-hmm.
And we're just now, in my opinion, beginning to know what we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I think for much of the 20th century, we didn't know what we didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the 21st century is what my grandmother would say, it's a come to Jesus moment.
Yeah.
And we're beginning to see the declines in populations. We have better tools to measure these declines.
Mm-hmm.
So we're beginning to grapple here with the impact and what that means for our food supply. In the United States, we tend to have a right to think we tend to think that we have a right to cheap food.
Mm-hmm.
We don't think twice to pay $30 for a bouquet of flowers, but if we were to have to pay $15 for a bag of apples,
Mm-hmm.
We wail and gnash and grieve and so moving into the future, we're going to have to consider these things.
So that makes more sense on why, when they say a species is dying out, why it is so very important. We need to try to help protect them.
Sure, because it's going to mean an increase in food prices at some point down the line. And if we don't have access to certain types of food, obviously that impacts our health.
So for instance, if the pumpkin bee, you're saying, if it died out, then could other bees support pumpkins?
No.
Or no? Okay.
I mean, honeybees can,
But not as well.
But they're genetically different. Pumpkin bees are early morning risers, and they like to get out and pollinate first thing in the morning, like 7 a.m. And you can see them working. In fact, when the pumpkin blossom opens, they will be surrounding that blossom. You can see them working. Honeybees don't really start working until 9 a.m.-ish. They like to sleep in a little bit. They're kind of like college students that way. There are some differences there. Mason bees are great orchard bees. Their life cycle is done by the beginning of June. That's it.
So sleeping in, what you said, where do bees live in the wintertime when you don't see them?
So it depends upon the species of bee. But our bees on our back porch are in hives.
Right.
And I like to use a phrase from my colleague at Ohio State, Jim Tu, says bees jog in place in the wintertime. They formed a cluster and they're consuming the honey that we've left for them to stay warm. They will stay anywhere between the range of about 55 to sometimes as high as 90. And they're consuming honey that whole time while they're jogging in place. So they're in a hive. Our bees are in a hive. But mason bees stay in bamboo tubes And so this last week of February, I will start watching our mason beehives to see when it begins to warm up a little bit more. There's more daylight. The plants produce more pollen. We'll start to see these mason bees emerge. And that's always, for me, an exciting time, too. It's just as exciting as watching our honeybees.
And you mentioned a little bit ago about kind of some of the decline in the bees. Can you tell us what's causing that or some of the issues surrounding that?
Yeah, there are many factors impacting the decline of pollinators in general. One of the biggest issues has been our changing uses of land. Grass is the number one crop in the United States. Grass doesn't produce very much pollen or nectar, and so then that impacts nutrition of all pollinators, not just honeybees. We've deforested an enormous amount of acreage, so that we can have the agricultural industry that we have. Suburbs, we grow as many houses as we do crops now. So that's a big factor. Everyone points fingers at the increase in agricultural chemicals, validly so. One of my hats that I wear as the state apiarist is I take samples for the USDA Honeybee Health Survey. And I take beeswax samples so that we can get a sense of what kinds of agricultural chemicals the bees are inadvertently bringing back to the hive. So we're beginning to have a clearer sense now of what those chemicals look like. So there's no doubt that agricultural chemicals are impacting pollinator declines. That's a big issue. On one hand, we have an increasing number of beginner beekeepers, but the serious commercial beekeepers, that number continues to decline. It's a tough industry for young people to make a living in. You have to have an enormous amount of capital to get started. A young man goes to a bank to try to get a loan for a flatbed tractor. If he doesn't know that this young man's a beekeeper, he's inclined to say no. Once he learns he's a beekeeper, he's definitely inclined to say no. He knows that loan is going to be kind of dicey in terms of getting it paid back. So there's a lot of challenges to be a successful beekeeper. And we see that in these losses that are happening. With beginner beekeepers, there's an enormous learning curve. We say in the beekeeping world, you'll be a beginner for 20 years. And that's true, So hopefully we're getting better at the education part of it so that beginners can take better care of their bees. But
since we're talking about landowners and bees, what should a landowner do if they're interested in beekeeping?
The very basic thing that they need to do first is to get a soil sample. They need to know what is going on with their soils, and then figure out from there if they should modify that or not. Typically, grass is the enemy to really good pollinator habitat. So then, depending upon their philosophical preferences, they may need to apply a herbicide, and what we call in the industry a 3-season kill. Where they establish a first round of herbicide spraying the first week of August, follow that up before the first killing frost in October, do one more herbicide kill in March. Then their flower seed may have a halfway decent chance. Seed companies would prefer actually a 4-season kill. But it's really difficult for homeowners who've been looking at brown grass for 3 seasons to want to do that. But you have to establish pollinator habitat for your bees, really, for them to be successful. I get some brushback, I guess, from audiences when I talk about herbicides. I'm never against using cardboard, but I think for many people, they don't realize that an acre is the size of a football field. And that's a whole lot of cardboard that you're trucking out there if you're trying to convert an acre of land into pollinator habitat. The best option for many substantial landowners is to do a prescribed burn. And finally, I think we have a prescribed burn cancel. So, your listeners would want to go to that website and touch base with those folks before they do this. I think some of us are a little hesitant to get out and just start a fire.
Right.
But you have to have burn breaks in place, ponds, roads, things like that. So that takes some planning. I guess that's the biggest thing that I see with many people is they just want to go out and just plant flowers. And that, and they don't take into consideration the challenge that grass is going to be, especially Johnson grass in this state. It's going to be your perennial challenge.
Talk a little bit about your research. You've been looking at some of the forested species that landowners could plant. You mentioned flowers, so there are also trees that could help. Is that
Right.
correct? Or?
There's a fairly long history of forest-based beekeeping in Kentucky, especially in eastern Kentucky. It was not too long ago that almost every family had a bee gum, and that was one of their major sources of sugar. Most people assume that a beehive just accrues nectar and they make honey at a steady rate over the year. And in fact, they make most of their honey during certain windows of opportunity when there is what we call a nectar flow.
Okay.
And that's when a particular species is in bloom. And, we think of clovers and wildflowers and things like that, but trees also bloom. And there's a few species in Kentucky, notably basswood and sourwood, that make varietal honeys, that people are kind of interested in having a honey that's derived from the nectar of just that tree.
Yeah, I've seen sourwood honey. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't crystallize. It has certain properties, and people are kind of into different types of honey. So those honeys generally will sell for a little bit more a pound than your basic clover honey. So the idea with my research was to try and find locations in eastern Kentucky where you could put hives and be in close proximity to aggregations of those trees.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. This is Dr. Matt Springer. I'm an Assistant Extension Professor of Wildlife Management within the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources here at University of Kentucky. I'm here to teach you a little bit about the animals that live in our forests, especially those here in Kentucky. For those of you who might just be joining us, each week we'll play a wildlife sound from our forest. Here's our sound for this week. Stay tuned towards the end of the show. We'll talk about this animal and why it is making that sound.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview.
And we should probably explain that a bee gum is actually a beehive, except that it's been taken from the trunk of a tree.
Oh, okay.
And many settlers that's where the bees would locate themselves in the interior of a tree, which tends to decay first there. And so these bees would establish their hives there, and then settlers would just simply cut the tree where the bees were and maintain the hives from there on. And they would always call them bee gums because black gum had tended to be a very popular tree of choice for bees that were swarming.
Okay.
So the term gum then has been handed down for centuries, and it's another term that beekeepers use to describe hives.
Yeah.
So are there other trees that you could plant to help with that situation in your backyard?
I mean, from a forestry standpoint, most foresters have, much different motivations for what they plant.
Right.
Bees would be a secondary concern. We were keeping bees on mine sites, and one of the nice things about those areas is you can be in close proximity to a bunch of trees and also have a lot of open forbs, wildflowers, things like that, so that you can get forage throughout the whole growing season, and then perhaps collect a honey crop off of one or two tree species.
Some other examples along those lines are your tulip poplars. Tulip poplar makes a very unique honey, and it also has a high value in the timber industry. Black locust is another species that is a really big honey producer, and people tend to use it in making fence posts, things like that.
Yeah, and it's not generally found in mature forests, but a lot it makes a really neat honey. It makes a water white honey. It's almost perfectly clear. It's an unusual honey.
So how do you know what honey is coming from where? I mean, the bees are flying everywhere. I mean, you can't just track one bee and tell where it's coming from.
Right, that's a really good question. And I mean, in short, you don't. You sort of depend on the properties of what the honey is that you extract. You can tell where it came from.
Okay.
The majority of the honey crop comes from periods of time where the bees collect nectar over and above what their yearly caloric needs are. So that will often happen, at least with trees, when, say, basswoods are flowering and they're copious nectar producers, and it's at a point in time where the colony has sort of maximum forager population, and they'll end up collecting almost all their nectar from that source. I think for something to be called a varietal honey, it has to have more than 50% of a particular nectar. Is that correct?
46% of one pollen. That's
okay.
And so you can have your honey tested.
Oh, okay.
Even though the methods still are not 100% perfect, this is the best that we can do in terms of being able to call a honey varietal, a specific honey varietal. That person needs to have a pollen analysis showing 46% of one pollen. And in all of the years I've been a beekeeper, I've just had what we call a monofloral or varietal honey. 1 year, that was in 2016, we actually had clover honey. My pollen analysis was showing all kinds of other things. And the yards that we produced our honey from are surrounded by black locusts. It's always been a surprise to me that I've never had a specific monofloral honey, but I also only take honey once a year. I'm never taking it at just precisely the point in time where things are blooming to be able to send that in. There is a cost involved with that, approximately $100 a sample. So, that's also been, that's one of the things that I would love to do is to be able to take a sample on a regular blooming cycle and see if that changes.
But there are things that the beekeeper can do to get the hives in the right place at the right time to ensure that they will collect the nectar that you're trying to produce. And that was sort of what my research was about.
Okay.
It was largely, I had originally thought, oh, this is great. There's all this satellite photography and all this great data, and I've learned a little bit about GIS. I thought, this is going to be a breeze. Just beep, boop, bop, boop. We'll put it all in there, and I'll know where every basswood and sourwood tree in eastern Kentucky is. And it did not turn out to be that easy. So what we ended up doing was more of a species distribution modeling approach. We took data from the Forest Inventory and Analysis program that the U.S. Forest Service runs. And then we also utilized the data set at Robinson Forest, which they maintain continuous forest inventory plots there. And basically we were able to sort of build a model and test one with the other to make sure that it was working, to try and find out what sort of conditions make it more likely that a basswood or a sourwood or a tulip poplar is going to grow there.
And what were those conditions that you found?
Tulip poplar is so widespread that in terms of collecting nectar, any place that you find basswood, there's also going to be enough tulip poplar around to satisfy those needs. So this is all about site selection of where exactly to put your apiary on a site.
Okay.
There's a trade-off for the bees. The further away the nectar source is, the more calories they burn going to get it. So you want to try and get them in as close as you can to their nectar source. In terms of basswood, we found that they, at least in the Kentucky River watershed and with the data that we were using, have a fairly strong preference for sort of northeast facing aspects. They not big on ridge tops. There's several variables that go into it, but at least testing one data set on the other, we were able to get pretty good numbers.
And those two species are really unique for eastern Kentucky. In other words, the honeys that they produce aren't just everywhere in the United States, but there are other species that landowners can plant that are also equally important in terms of nectar and pollen production. And so things like dogwood and redbud. Red maple is so important this time of year in terms of pollen production, and you can actually see in the hives when they start bringing in red maple. The You can pull out a frame and it will be all red. And that tells us even though we don't have a red maple in our backyard, red maple's going off somewhere. And so those are the kinds of things that landowners, if they are interested in just incorporating some different types of species of trees, willows are a really important early pollen and nectar producer. And so they may want to think about that. Willows. Witch hazel is unusual. I don't know if we call that a shrub or a tree, but it has an unusual tendency to produce and bloom pollen and nectar in both November and February. So we have 2 witch hazels in our backyard that are blooming right now. So that's an unusual thing that may fly off of people's radar screens simply because it's a shrub, more so in terms of size.
So what are some interesting facts about bees? I've heard like if you take the honey and eat so much of it, your allergies can disappear. Is that true or not? Not maybe disappear, but lessen.
Right. There's really very little, peer-reviewed scientific evidence to suggest that that's the case. But anecdotally, there are a lot of people that swear by it, more than you would think just by randomness or whatever.
Well, most people's allergies are caused by grasses, not flowers.
Right.
And bees go to flowers. So, if your allergies are caused by grasses, you're not probably getting the benefit that you think that you are.
Right.
However, honey has 14 antioxidants. And so if you are consuming that every day, then you are probably helping your immune system, although that has been less well studied. Honey is antibacterial. And so hospitals have been using it sometimes to treat burn wounds and or hand wounds, carpal tunnel, things like that. They've been trying to reduce scar tissue. New Zealand has been the leader in that front. The American Medical Association has only very recently been beginning to adopt some of their research into this. I know this because the office assistant at the Kentucky Department of Ag has had a foot surgery, and finally, after a prolonged period of time when the scar didn't heal as it should, her doctor started prescribing Manuka honey, which is from New Zealand. So I'm beginning to hear of these kind of isolated incidents where wounds aren't healing in a certain time frame. Doctors kind of throw up their hands and say, well, what have we got to lose?
Yeah. So kind of explain to us how honey is made or created, and then how do you get it out of a hive? How do you get it out from them? Because I know that they probably don't want to give it up.
Right. The nutritional needs of the colony are met entirely by collecting pollen and nectar. And honey is essentially nectar that has been concentrated. So the bees will bring nectar back, they deposit it into the hexagonal cells of wax that you see, and they do a lot of things to evaporate it. They pass it back and forth between each other, their wings, they do a lot of things, but basically it's concentrated and evaporated till there's only about 16 to 18% water in there. And that's what gives honey its antibiotic properties, is that most of the bacteria will just be desiccated by the fact that the water will be sucked out of their cell walls.
And let's back up too in terms of starting with the flowering plant. This may be more information than what you want to know, but
That's fine.
But flowering plants produce both pollen and nectar, and it takes an enormous amount of energy for a flowering plant to produce pollen. For instance, avocado trees typically only produce 1 grain of pollen per blossom. It's very easy for flowering plants to produce nectar. That just needs photosynthesis. That needs lots of sunlight, but the plants themselves can produce a lot of nectar. And that, through time, has become the bait that flowering plants use to attract pollinators. They can give them the sugary substance which pollinators need as carbohydrates, And the trade-off, once they've attracted these pollinators to their blossoms, then the plant itself can get its reproductive material in the terms of pollen traded either to another blossom in the same plant or to another plant, as the pollinator moves from plant to plant to plant. So that's kind of the trade-off that plants have evolved to help get their reproductive material in the environment, because plants are rooted. They can't go to a bar and meet some cute guy, and, or they can't go to the football game and doll up and look really pretty and attract somebody special. So they've evolved these what we call strategies. Floral nectar guides. Plant petals are part of that. If you see striated petals, that's probably they're acting as landing strips for pollinators to find where the nectaries are.
Oh, okay.
And then once the pollinator has landed, collected the nectar, then the plant will send out messages to the rest of the world. It'll either close up its blossoms and fall off because it's inefficient. If it's sitting there and empty and it doesn't have nectar, it's inefficient to kind of keep a track. It's like a Shell station that shuts off its neon lights at midnight. Drivers know not to stop.
Right.
And same thing with the petals and flowers.
Okay.
So you mentioned the bees come back to their, I guess, the hexagonal shape, kind of that honeycomb. How do they build that to begin with?
The bees are able to produce wax from glands in their body, and they can actually extrude small flakes of wax from their abdomen.
Okay.
So they actually make the wax and then build the combs themselves. And they're really one of the only insects that does that sort of thing.
And how long does it take to build?
It's seasonal.
Okay.
As with everything in the beehive, it's very seasonal. You have to have lots of plants blooming for them to go on and make beeswax. Between the months of March and June are primary beeswax building months, but it's almost like June 21st, it just cuts off. And then it gets very difficult for a hive to have enough resources to devote just to building beeswax. And beeswax is this amazing product. If you think about it, it has three primary functions in a hive. It's where the queen lays her eggs, so it's the brood area. It's where the honeybees bring back pollen and nectar, so it's the pantry. Right, that it stores the pantry. And then what I think, to me personally, is the most magical of uses, it's also the dance floor.
Okay.
So that once bees come back, they can communicate with each other, because everything is happening in the dark. They can communicate each other with these dances that we've heard about to help tell the other sisters where the really good quality nectar is, or where the mediocre quality nectar is. There's a kind of a voting system that happens, but it happens on the beeswax. That it forms this foundation for these sisters to talk to one another through movement, and it's really fundamental. We say in the beekeeping industry, it's the lungs of the beehive.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview.
I think many beginner beekeepers take beeswax for granted. They just don't understand the amount of resources needed for the hive to build that beeswax. There are things that beekeepers can do to help stimulate that. We feed them a lot of sugar water, and if we feed approximately 3 gallons of sugar water, they can go ahead and build beeswax on out, but they really prefer nectar resources. That's their primary source for not just their energy, their caloric needs, but also to help them build their habitat.
And how do you get the honey out of the hive then?
inside those white boxes that you see out in the field are dozens of wooden frames. And so you can take a part of the comb out individually, and that's called a frame. So you take a frame out and you put it inside what looks like a 55-gallon barrel that spins around, and it will spin the honey out. So centrifugal forces, you take the cappings off, you scratch the wax off the top of the cells, and then you spin out the honey and collect it. And then you can take those, what's called drawn comb, and return that to the hive, and they then don't have to rebuild that wax. They can fill it up again and make use of that.
So some honey that you get has the beeswax in it. So is that something that they needed? I mean, that you're taking that away from them, I guess?
Well, in the turn of the 20th century, there was a lot of adulterated honey on the market. You know, people were cutting it with sugar water or, using molasses and selling it as syrup or all kinds of things going on. And so it began to be a good marketing gimmick for beekeepers because you can't fake beeswax. I mean, if you see beeswax in that comb, you know that there is authentic honey in there. And so prices of comb honey typically double that of extracted honey. But you are, in fact, if you're a beekeeper and you're selling cut comb honey, then you are doing other things to help build that beeswax building capacity back up.
Oh, okay.
It was a certificate of authenticity, frankly. This is a good place to kind of, maybe bring your listeners up to date. The State Bee Association, the Kentucky State Beekeepers Association, has just launched the Certified Kentucky Honey Producer Program. This is a label that we are putting on jars that can assure the consumers that the honey that's in that jar is produced from hives that are here in the state, from plants that are planted in the state, because our nation currently imports 350 million pounds of honey.
Oh, wow.
Many beekeepers are reluctant to now do comb honey because there's a cost there.
So do they get mad when you're messing with their hive?
Yeah, there's a real art to it, as to how you're going to invade this hive and, examine the brood nest and do other things without setting off, a major defensive response.
Right.
And the key is having a smoker.
Well, I was wondering about that.
I went to South Africa, and I swear the knowledge I gained from working with a beekeeper in South Africa paid for the plane ticket. And she tended to smoke her colonies approximately 20 to 30 minutes because she's working with the very defensive African honeybee. She taught me to have a lot of space between the colonies, to smoke the colonies 20 to 30 minutes before going into them. The colony is a collection of chemicals, and I am a collection of chemicals. And so smoking, using the smoker as a tool and not a weapon is absolutely critical. That smoke will mask and neutralize the chemicals I'm wearing, the toothpaste, the shampoo that I've used, the detergents on my clothes. It also lets the bees slurp up honey in their honey crop. Bees have 2 stomachs, so they will slurp up honey and store it, and that tends to make them less likely to sting. Having said that, Doug's completely correct. In the middle of May, bees are so docile, it's almost like you kind of rub them like you rub the belly of a dog. August, if it's a drought, we have to suit up, we have to smoke longer and steadier. It's a different ball game. There's not the nectar resources out there. There are more bees. The hives have increased now. We're not working with 50,000 bees. We're working with 70,000. So there are more guard bees. So it's a seasonal thing.
So what does smoke do to them?
Well, as I said, the bees have 2 stomachs. So they have a digestive stomach like you and I have, but they also have what they call a honey crop. And what that crop is used for is when the forager is out in the field and she's slurping up nectar from the plant, that's where that nectar is stored until it becomes dehydrated into honey when it comes back to the hive. So the thinking among some people is that when smoke kind of first enters the hive, that's a trigger in the colony's response. Like, our house could be on fire, and we're going to need energy to be able to fly someplace else. So the thinking here is that the bees then slurp up honey in that crop, and they get ready, and then it's just like you at Thanksgiving dinner once you've had a full meal. You're less likely to do anything.
Right.
And that's kind of the thinking here. Having said that, I can attest, I have been run out of my own apiary many a time after using a smoker. So kind of take that for what it's worth. But it does, in fact, I think, help with masking my chemicals.
Prevents them from organizing a response, too. It sort of puts some static in the air, because inside the hive, bees are communicating largely by pheromone, largely by smell.
Is it true once they sting you, they die? Is that...
That was my next question. Yeah.
I just always heard that as a kid.
Is
I didn't
true.
know.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're talking honeybees.
Yeah, okay.
Right. I mean,
Other
like,
bees...
there are other stinging insects that can sting you repeatedly,
Okay,
and they will not die. So
Okay,
we
no,
want to
that's
be
good
clear here.
clarification.
Yeah,
No, that's
I mean, yellow jackets. I'm thinking of yellow jackets in particular, but with honeybees, that's correct.
Okay.
And that's when they sting something like us that has skin, and they're barbed.
The stinger is, in fact, barbed, and so...
Yeah, their barbed stinger gets stuck in there, and it basically pulls apart their abdomen when they pull it out. Now, they can sting other insects and other things where they can retrieve their stinger. It doesn't necessarily, but when it stings a person, yes, they will die afterwards.
And we should clarify, too, that the nurse bees, their stingers haven't developed. Their primary role in the hive is to take care of the younger bees. So we can do a lot in the hive. When I take samples for USDA, for instance, I'm taking samples from the brood area where the nurse bees are. So typically I don't wear gloves, because they slow me down. I'm pulling out frames from the brood area, and I just simply take a cup of bees and drop them into my sample box. And I rarely get stung because I'm working with a younger aged bee. The foragers are older bees. They're defenders. The guard bees. So it's an older aged bee that has developed the stinger. Some other things you were asking about, interesting facts. Only the females have stingers. When I'm talking to third graders, it's always a point of delight when I mention that the male bees do not have stingers. Their reproductive parts here are, they just don't have stingers. The males exist to mate, and when I'm talking to itty bitty kids, I'll say, they like to cuddle. They don't necessarily have to defend the hive. But yes, in fact, communication in the hive is in the dark, and so it's always by chemical interaction, and the stinger has sacs, venom sacs, and once that stinger is pulled from that bee, the abdomen of that bee, that venom sac just explodes, and so the alarm pheromone can go everywhere. You can smell it when it's really triggered. It kind of smells like a banana custard, and then it's on. And you really need your veil on and your jacket and your smoker. You need all of the tools.
In addition, commercial beekeepers breed for docile bees. Bees that show a strong defensive response don't last long in a beekeeping operation.
A lot of the temperament of the hive comes from the queen. And so if we get what we call a hot hive, and I have yet, to see the kind of major defensiveness that we associate with African honeybee hives. But if we get a hot hive, like there's one at our one of our apiaries that her days are numbered. I don't think twice. We will definitely call those hot hives out, especially if we're in an urban environment. We have the added pressure and responsibility to make sure that we have hives that are a little bit more docile.
So can you put a new queen in and they'll be fine with that and just take her out, or will they defend to get not to let you take her out? Or is the answer yes?
Hive is a collection of chemicals, so we go in, we find that queen of the hot hive, remove her, and let it sit for 48 hours, let her pheromones dissipate, and then put a new queen in.
Okay.
We're kind of running out of time here, but I wanted to talk, you mentioned earlier about kind of the 2 books that you had written on bees. Can you just talk briefly about those 2 books?
Well, so I wrote the first book, Bees in America, when I was a horrible beekeeper. I was really much more interested in the sociology and how we have taken this insect and ascribed an entire political philosophy to it. For instance, I think many of our societal thoughts about poverty go back to the 17th century, when we would assume that if you weren't industrious enough, as the honeybee is, then somehow being poor is your fault. You haven't worked enough, you haven't saved enough like honeybees do. In the 17th century, people thought that drones were lazy, because all they did was reproduce. We now have a better understanding of the pheromones of male bees inside the hive. We know how critical drones are to the healthy functioning system of a honeybee colony. But a lot of our ideas haven't evolved. A lot of our political ideas about poverty have not evolved along with our knowledge of the colonies. So that was what the first book was. The second book, while I was writing the first one, I just was meeting, amazing women as queen producers and as research scientists, and that they had always been there. In Ireland, there was the lead beekeeper at a convent. Her name is Saint Gobnat, which means Deborah or bee in Hebrew. So we've always had these images of women beekeepers that have just been off the radar screen. So I wanted a book to pull all of these amazing women together. Yeah. And then the third book to be all about bees and trees, because I've started this trilogy of past, present. So the third book will be about the future.
Oh, that's great. Okay.
And I see that forests are going to be the future of bees in the United States and maybe the world.
Well, you two have presented us with a lot of great information on bees, and we thank you for that. So what would be 1 or 2 takeaway items that either one of you might want to leave our listeners with?
I always like to remind people that not all bees sting. That's
right, because
big one.
people see a bee and they automatically think they're going to get stung. Yeah,
and that's a huge fear that we impose on people. And you take something. There's another species that we didn't talk about, the mason bee, which is a great orchard bee. It's an early spring bee. It's the most beautiful blue. It's like a denim blue underneath a microscope. Minor bees are so low to the ground. You would have to lie flat on the ground, just to even get close to them, And so, bumbles hate to sting, I mean, you really have to force that issue. I think, we have tended to fixate on stinging behavior of bees, and when the vast majority of them, it's not as much of an issue as people think.
Okay.
I guess if I had one takeaway, the first thing people always ask me when they find out I'm a beekeeper is, how's colony collapse going? Are all the bees in the world going to die? And that's a bit of a misconception, in the sense that the honeybee, Apis mellifera, that we cultivate is not going anywhere. It's experienced a lot of problems, but it has agricultural value. It is actively cultivated by people. It exists on, 7 continents. It's everywhere. And we're going to take care of honeybees. They're not going anywhere, even if the industry struggles through different parasites and pesticides and everything else. But what we are doing is sort of conducting an uncontrolled experiment on the other insects that are in the environment. Our pesticides affect, if they don't affect honeybees, they're certainly affecting other bees and other bugs.
Except that some of the attention is well-deserved and valid. And we need to keep monitoring these things. And, ideally, I would love to see us move away from all agricultural chemicals. But, we don't have the genetic reserves right now in place to do that. I'm not anti-chemical, but the applicators have an enormous amount of flexibility about when they apply their chemicals. So just simply wait until night. so that the product can dry through the course of the evening.
Yeah.
You know, that's a responsible way of using agricultural chemicals. I will plug the Kentucky Department of Ag has created a registry. So if a person has a product with a label that requires communication, then they can go on this at the Kentucky Department of Ag Honeybee website and plug in the date and the time that they intend to apply this particular product. And the beekeepers who have put their bees on this registry will get an email. And this is for free. You know, so applicators can be in compliance with EPA label laws. You know, it takes 5 minutes to register this, and beekeepers can have a heads up if there's something particularly toxic in the environment. Okay. So we're trying. The Kentucky Department of Ag is trying to better communication between applicators and beekeepers. This is an ongoing thing, and it can take many different forms. You know, you don't have to use this pollinator protection app, is what we call it. If you see that label that requires communication, you may choose to use a different product. You know, and then that works fine.
All right. Well, thank you guys both so much for coming in today. And if you'd like any more information on what you heard today, please visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
Thank you.
we enjoyed it.
Stay tuned now for wildlife sounds from the forest.
Welcome back to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. I'm Dr. Matt Springer, Assistant Extension Wildlife Professor in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. Before I tell you what that sound was you heard at the beginning of the show, let's play it again for you.
That seems to be a sound that we're all familiar with, but I would not consider that a wildlife sound.
That is not a wildlife sound. That's just the sound of spring rain. Okay. And the reason we're going to talk about that is because this time of year we start getting more of those spring showers, right? Well, that's a big cue for one of our groups of wildlife species that rely on that for their life cycle.
Okay.
And those are salamanders.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So what do salamanders look like?
Well, salamanders are a group of amphibians that do have 4 legs and toes and a tail. Most of us have probably seen them. They range in size from really small, and their life cycle, you may find salamanders that are about an inch and a half in size, to our larger salamanders like the spotted salamander. You're looking at potentially a foot long.
Oh.
From head to tail. Okay. We have over 20 different species in Kentucky, and in the spring, with the spring rains, what ends up happening is those salamanders will start traveling from where they've been spending most of their time, especially our salamanders that live in the woods. They'll come out sometimes from underground. They spend their entire life underground except for this time of year. They'll come out and they'll start walking and looking for those ponds that are created by those spring showers to mate and lay their eggs.
Okay. So what different colors are there?
Oh, so a wide range. There's some that are very dark and grayish black, to something like our cave salamander is bright red.
Oh.
Very vibrant in color, to our spotted salamander is like a grayish color with big yellow spots on its entire body. And then we have the biggest salamander, which is our hellbender, which is pretty much entirely lives its life in water, is about 2 feet long and got really wrinkly skin, and it's a face of only a mother can love.
So do you have any idea why they called it a hellbender?
I have no idea about
It's
that.
just-
I mean, there's some other interesting names associated with it.
So you said they live underground, like
Some
where
of
exactly?
some of our species will live and spend most of their life in the soil. Rely on earthworms and those kind of things to survive. Some you could flip rocks over and you'll find them living under the rocks. We have species that live entirely in the water. Sirens are a good example out in western Kentucky. And then we have some that have a mix. You, for the most part, have a harder time finding salamanders outside of the spring because they're much more active in the spring. You could drive along a road, and if you're at the right spot between what's called a vernal pool, those ponds that get built up, you may come from a wood block on the one side of the road and the vernal pools on the left. You'll see potentially hundreds of salamanders walking across that road right after a spring rain and it warms up. So folks will actually drive around and look for them, at night. You'll see them and you can find them. Yeah.
So if you do find them, should you pick them up?
May be a good idea to escort them off the roadway. Ideally, you don't want to handle them too much because they have skin issues that's how they breathe. So if you get too much, material on their skin, or you take that slimy residue off their skin, it leaves them a little vulnerable. However, if you're worried about them getting run over, I would go with get them off the road versus I'm worried about touching them. So some of the populations are rare potentially, or we don't know a lot about them. We don't want folks going out there and grabbing a whole bunch of them and use them as bass bait. Obviously,
right.
That wouldn't be good.
So do they make noises? Since we had the rain noise.
Not really. They're not a vocal species.
Okay.
So.
All right. So when they lay these eggs, how many offspring do they end up having?
So that would depend on the species of salamander and the size of the salamander. Usually, the larger the female, the more eggs they can produce. You aren't going to find 5 eggs. You're going to usually find dozens of eggs.
Yeah, usually you see on TV, you see a whole bunch of eggs.
Yeah, so they do reproduce in larger bunches because they have one shot at sometimes their entire lifetime to really. So when you think about it, they're longer lived than you'd think. Several years, 6, 7, 8, 9 years. But in that period of time, depending on the weather, they may only get one real shot to have all their eggs hatch. With these vernal pools, if they only get one rainstorm and it dries out right away, then all the eggs are gone. They lost their entire production for that year. So they don't just, they're more of a boomer bust species versus, say, humans are much more of you can have one and put a lot of effort into that one individual or 2 individuals.
Okay.
So, and some of the other hellbender nicknames.
Yeah.
Snot otter.
Snot otter, okay.
The Allegheny alligator. The devil dog, the mud devil, and lasagna lizard was the other one.
Wonder where they came up with lasagna lizard.
I think it's because of the way their skin folds. It looks like the layers in a lasagna.
Lasagna. Okay.
Yeah, they're fun nicknames.
Yeah, sounds like it.
We should just do a show solely on wildlife nicknames.
Yeah, let's do that.
I think so. Like the timberdoodle.
That's definitely.
Which is our woodcock.
Right.
So, yes.
All right. Well, thank you for coming in today. We appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
Thank you for joining us today. And we have a new show schedule for spring 2019. You can listen to us live on WRFL 88.1 FM on Mondays from 11 a.m. to noon. And if you missed the Monday shows, you can listen to our podcasts on our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM and, of course, via radio at 88.1 FM in the Central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.